Okay, great. So today I'm going to be doing a training on a guideline for code reviews. So I've heard a bit about people not being sure, what do you include in a code review? Who does code reviews? And so really today covering a few different things, which include what is a code review, why do we do them, how do we do them, and who should do them. So let's start off with what is a code review. You can have an official definition of it if you want. So code reviews is something to have quality assurance of the code base, but really what we know it as is just, it's something to check the code before it's merged. That's to put it as simple as possible. So why do we do them? This is quite subjective, so people do them for different reasons, but they really stand behind three different pillars. Firstly, it's for quality control. So when you're merging a piece of code into your code base, you want to make sure that the code is clean, that there aren't any issues such as repetition or whatever else you're checking for, and that what you're merging into your code base is going to improve the general quality rather than make it worse. Secondly, there's risk management. When you merge in code to your code base, you can introduce a bug, you can introduce a security issue, you can cause stability problems, etc. So really going through these code reviews makes sure that you're doing all those checks, making sure that whatever you're merging keeps your project safe and that there won't be any issues with it. And then thirdly, there's team visibility and learning. When somebody does a code review, they are learning from what you're doing. Even if, to begin with, they have no idea what this code is, by having a look of how you're implementing something, looking at different ways, whether it's an easier method of implementation, something like that, they're learning through those code reviews. So it's not just about improving the code base, it's also about improving the knowledge of people on your team. And that's what's really nice. So now to the chunkiest part of this presentation, which is what do we check and how do we check it? So again, code reviews are very subjective. Depending on who you'll ask, they'll tell you different things. So I went around the office asking people, what do they check in code reviews? Bear in mind that only 7 people replied, so this is only a very small amount of people. But as you can see, 4 people said silly mistakes, so things like spelling or leftover console logs, and 4 people also said readability. So those were the biggest 2 things that people checked when they were doing code reviews. Then there are other things that people mentioned. So they mentioned structure, the structure of your code, the structure of your files, code smells, logic issues, edge cases, etc. And there's probably a lot more if there were more people around the day I actually asked these questions. So we'll focus on the 3 pillars I mentioned, and we'll start off with code quality. Again, here there's lots of different things to check, but these are the things that I've seen most often and that will improve the quality of your code in general. The first one is readability. Readability is very important because it tends to be what people leave out quite easily. So if you're reading a piece of code, you've read it the first time, you don't understand it. You read it a second time, you still don't understand it. And you just keep reading it until you ask the person, or you've read it 10 times, and then you finally understand what the function is doing. That's bad. That means that your code isn't very readable, and you should put a comment on it. It can be as simple as just a variable naming. If the naming doesn't reflect what that component is doing, or what that function is doing, it's not readable. If you can't read it, another dev will have the same problem. So it's best to leave a comment. And then there's also conventions. So conventions are more broad. It's things such as Boolean notation or any other convention you can think of. And that's always good to comment about because it makes sure that all devs are following the same standard. And when you pass that project on to another group, they'll still be able to read what you've done. Now, the second one's quite nice, so it's code smells. There is a list of all the different code smells you can possibly have, but honestly, code smells are more your instinct. If you've looked at something and it doesn't look right, something's probably wrong with it. So just trust your senses. After you've developed for a while, even when you start developing, if something doesn't look quite right, there might be something wrong with it, and it's best just to leave a comment. And the third one is refactoring. files can get very long, especially when you're adding more and more functionality to something or you're adding more methods into it. They can get very long, and then it is good to refactor. Because if ever you've tried to read a 1,000 line file, probably after the first 100, your brain's just not going to want to process it anymore, and that's going to happen for any developer out there. Other things you can do is there a better way of writing this? If you see that there is a lot of looping, there's a lot of nested components, you might want to try and to refactor it, write it in a simpler way that is more understandable. So this actually links up to readability again. And then something that might not always be the case is just to think, can it be a shared component? So of course, when you're looking at somebody's code review, you're not going to look at the entire code base and be like, oh, okay, I've seen this in 3 other places. It's more of what you remember. If you think you've seen this before, it could be good to leave a comment just saying, seen this before, could it be a shared component? And then finally, there's test coverage, especially if your project does test coverage. Some projects don't focus on tests so much, but if yours do, it's good to think, okay, functionality has changed, a new feature has been implemented, can it be tested? So that's quite a few things that you can check, so I'm not expecting you to remember it at all, but just with those notions, let's try with 2 examples. So I've tried to make this as BizDev friendly as possible, so the first line is just, you've got an item, you're assigning it a message from your data. And then the other one, so map, is just you're looping through something and you've got an array, so lots of different values, and you're checking something for each one. I'm sorry if this is not good, but there you go. So just looking at this, is there anything that seems wrong? So imagine I opened a pull request and my function looks a bit like that. Can anybody see something wrong?
The comments aren't very clear.
Yeah, so the comments do something. I'm just imagining that there's some function happening in there. But good spot. If I did have comments like that, you should probably comment on it because it's not clear at all what they are. Anything else?
Will it end up undefined?
Mm-hmm. So, yep, we're missing a case when it's undefined. That's also an edge case we've got there. Let's try and pick somebody random. James?
I can't read that out.
You can't read that. Okay, somebody closer up. David?
I'd say really use a switch statement here.
Yep.
3s in there.
Yep, exactly. So the first thing you notice at the top is readability. Something's called item 1. What does item 1 do? What does this mean? So already you can't really read it. You don't understand what's going on. Might want to rename that component. And then, like David was saying, this is a code smell. That you've got a lot of ifs. This isn't the best way of writing it. You would probably want to use a switch statement instead. So this is a really simple version of what could happen. But again, it's really use your instincts. Something doesn't look right. You don't understand what's going on. Best to leave a comment. Now, let's try another one. This one's a bit more difficult. For any biz devs out there, imagine that this is a function where you're passing it some sort of string, so some bits of text, and you're saying it's a date, and you're converting that date to the format date, month, year. Now, this one's a bit more difficult. Akshar, can you tell anything's wrong with it? This one's a tricky one.
When you say date equals new date,
Mm-hmm.
One, it's easy to get confused with what's like a keyword and like something that you define.
Mm-hmm.
So if this is like a date version of the date string,
Mm-hmm.
what does it represent? Something else? Anything else?
Mm-hmm.
Convert date format.
Yep, you're completely right. The naming here wasn't great. I did this pretty quickly, like 5 minutes before the training, so the naming is definitely something out there. I haven't pointed out, but you're completely right. I probably should change this in terms of readability. Now, the difficulty here is, firstly, I've introduced something new. I'm saying we're formatting this string, we're turning it into date, it probably should be tested. So no matter how small the function is, it is better to simply test it because it's a new functionality you're adding, and even if the test is super simple, it is better in the long term. And then the tricky part here is actually looking at those line numbers. Can't see it that long, but we're on line 534 of this file. Something's wrong here. Ideally, if you see this in anybody's pull request, you can still see the line number, and if you see something like that, your first idea is, can it be put something else? Like, something's wrong here. This potentially could be put into a UTIS folder, a shared folder, something that won't extend the length of this file even further. So this one is a bit more of a tricky one. Now, a second thing to look at is when is a code review the most effective? What I mean by this is somebody's written a piece of code, they've opened a pull request, they've given this to you. How can you make sure that when you're doing this code review, you're doing it as best as you can? So first thing to check is the CI. If the pipeline is failing, if the tests aren't passing, if the checks aren't passing, instead of looking at all the code, telling them something's wrong, and then realizing, oh yeah, actually this functionality doesn't work out, I'm going to rewrite the entire PR, it means that you spend time reviewing some code that wasn't quite correct. So better, just look at the checks. If something's not passing, tell the developer that's opened this pull request. It might just be that they'll tell you, oh yes, I'm stuck, I actually don't know what's going on here. And then fair enough, best to review the code, see if you can help them. But sometimes it's simply them saying, oh yeah, I didn't actually see that, let me have a look into it. And that has saved both of you time for them to address it straight away. Now the second one, which I'm also very guilty of, is long code reviews. If you've got something that changes 20 files, changes 200 lines, whatever it is, and is going to take somebody 3 hours to review it, it's too long. You probably shouldn't be doing that, because after about 10 minutes, somebody's gonna, don't want to say lose interest, but basically lose interest in looking at that code, and they're less likely to give you valuable feedback because they'll just be skipping over some sections. So if you've got code reviews which are long, try and problem solve it. Is there a way that you can either split the ticket, whatever it is, to make sure that you've got short code reviews that will ensure you get the best feedback possible? If you have to do long code reviews, so for example, if you're working both on the back end and the front end and those changes need to happen, make sure you take a break. Don't force yourself to go hours on end looking at this code if you're sensing that your mind is wandering elsewhere. Just take a break. Third one is metrics. Metrics are very project specific. They will depend on things that you might check which are different to other projects. So for example, if your project is very focused on security, that's something you should keep an eye out even more. If there are other metrics or other standards that belong to your project, make sure you keep an eye out on that. So that's actually kind of flowing into the coding standards. Depending on your project, you might have to be more careful about certain stuff rather than others. So for this one, I don't really have examples because it's a general idea of, if the CI is failing, tell the developer. If the CR is too long, try and inquire why it's gotten that long, etc. And then finally, feedback. So feedback really is the writing, whatever you're commenting on and how you make those comments. The most important thing is genuinely to have a positive approach. If you're commenting on somebody's pull request and you're telling them this is horrible, like this is definitely not the right way of doing it, what were you thinking? That's not good team spirit. Not only is it not good team spirit, but that also means that that person's going to get disheartened. They're likely to just saying it's not a good approach. Always be positive. If you're positive about something, even just commenting saying, oh yeah, this is a really great pattern, or thanks for refactoring, I hadn't noticed this, it really brings on that mindset of you've done a good job, I've just have these small comments that go with it. And that's really good to motivate people, to make sure that there's trust within the team, etc. So stay positive. And then the second thing is suggestions. So often somebody will look at a piece of code, they'll think in their mind, oh, I would have done this differently, but this is fine, and then leave it as that. They won't make a comment, they'll simply think it in their head and won't say anything. Don't do that. If you've got a suggestion, even if it ends up not working out, the developer tells you, oh no, that's not actually the best method of doing it, it's good to still write it down. Because once you've written that suggestion, the developer will start questioning what they've written. And then they'll think, oh, okay, this might be a better method of doing it. Let me have a think about it. So even if it's a question, a suggestion, or whatever it is, it's better to comment it, even though the comment might not end up being followed through, whatever it is, but it's better for it to be there. And moving with those suggestions, you have references. Sometimes you'll have seen a better method somewhere else, and it's good to just put that link there and say, how about trying it this way? And of course, we love Stack Overflow. Stack Overflow will probably have exactly the same conversation you're about to have on your code review, and you can avoid those back and forth by simply linking to one and telling the person to have a look there. And finally, conflicts. When on a code review, you've had a few back and forths on a comment, it doesn't seem to be resolved, it's better to just jump on a call. 20 back and forths on a comment will probably not lead to anything, will create more confusion, will just take up more time, and it's basically equivalent to a 3-minute chat, which will probably resolve everything. So you can either think it's going to end up saying, this is important, we'll have an investigation, look into it later, or, oh, okay, I misunderstood your comment, this is what you actually meant. So if you're finding that something has a few back and forths, just jump on the call. It's much easier, and it makes sure that you get your point across a lot more easily. Okay, that was a lot of things that you can check. Honestly, it's very subjective. It's mostly what works best for you, but they are things to keep in mind when you are looking at somebody else's code. And so the fourth part of it is who should do the code reviews? Does anybody have an idea of who should be doing all your code reviews? Anyone in your team? Anybody have a different idea? Any developer in the team? All devs in the team regardless of their level? Yep, you're basically all right. It's any developer. Any developer should be able to do your code review. The reason behind this is not just about sharing responsibility, making sure that one person isn't doing all the work. So often people have a misconception of it's the architect that does all the code reviews. That puts an incredible amount of responsibility on them, and it just means that they might be spending 3-4 hours in a day just doing code reviews, rather than being able to help other members of the team doing other things as well. So the first point for that is sharing responsibility. Secondly, literally anybody can do them. It's looking at a piece of code, and if you're not sure about something, just put a question. It's fine if it's maybe a pattern you haven't seen before and you want to question it, because even if it is a simple question, it's still forcing that developer to interrogate themselves about the method of application. Is this the right thing to do? How can I make it clearer to any other developer that sees it? And that's that. And also, if you're doing a code review, you see something you're not familiar with, you can always add on. So even if you do 90% of that code review, 10% you're not really comfortable in doing the code review, then you can just add on. Ask somebody, can you have a look at this part? I'm not really confident in it. Because that means that you're not only challenging yourself, but you're also learning. You're learning by looking at other people's code, you're learning by asking these questions, and also you're learning by looking at different approaches. So by looking at those code reviews, you familiarize yourself with the repository, you have a better idea of all the different patterns that are available, and also by looking at other people's code review, you can improve the general quality because you make sure that you keep things consistent throughout the code base. So literally anybody can do a code review. If you're not comfortable with it, you could pair for your first code review. Say to somebody, can you spend 2 minutes looking at this with me? I'm not really comfortable with doing my first one on my own. And that's totally fine, because the key point is that you should be learning with these code reviews, and it's great to challenge yourself. Okay, and finally, these are some general tips. So we've talked a lot about the theory of code reviews, what you should be looking at, how you should be doing them, but it's also nice to know what are concrete things you can do. So the first thing I would suggest is using indicators. So before you write your comment, it's good to be able to show the writer of the code what you're about to ask. Sometimes it's something readability, and in that case you'd put a readability tag and simply say, I don't really understand what this variable does, can you rename it? Sometimes it can be a question, a general inquiry, and sometimes, this is the most important one, a non-blocking comment. A non-blocking comment is when you're questioning something, you might be suggesting a different way of doing things, but the code can still be merged without that comment being addressed. because oftentimes you'll have a comment that leads into a discussion and nobody wants to merge it before that discussion is complete. In that case, a non-blocking one is clearly saying, I just want to chat about this. This might lead into an investigation afterwards, but you can still merge it if it's not addressed. If you're curious about any other indicators you can have on your code reviews, then there's something called conventional comments, which will show you lots of different tags you can add to your comments when you're doing a code review. And the second thing, which I think I've emphasized a lot during these slides, is asking questions. Any comment is a valid comment, even if it is as simple as, what does this variable do? Or I don't really understand the point of this function. It's still fine because you're making the author question why they've written it, why they've done the implementation the way that they have. You're also helping yourself because you're improving your knowledge. If you're not sure about something, somebody can teach you what that means or what that method of implementation is, and you've improved your knowledge for the future. And this also helps others in the team. The reason for that is if you're thinking of this question, other people will likely be thinking of the same question. So by putting that question out there, somebody else who has a look might be asking themselves the same thing, and the answer will already be there. So it literally helps everybody. Helps the author, helps you, and helps the team in general. So don't hesitate to ask any questions on a code review because they're always important. Okay, so that's the end of these slides.